Welcome, everyone, and good evening. My name is Nsé Ufot. I'm the Executive Director of the New Georgia Project Action Fund, and I am thrilled to introduce Beto O'Rourke, a Democratic presidential candidate and the former congressman from El Paso, Texas. Collectively, we were all drawn to his groundbreaking campaign against Ted Cruz that drew record-breaking turnout in Texas. His Senate race got national attention using unconventional strategies, including showing up to all 254 counties for every single voter. I'm excited to welcome Beto tonight as he shares his message about connecting every American back into the democracy. Just this morning, he released his voting rights plan, which will add tens of millions more people to the voter rolls by 2024, but also to ensure that every single person registered to vote can cast their ballot and that every single vote is counted. You've heard from lots of leaders in the voting rights space, but tonight is an opportunity to hear from, directly from Beto about how together we can ensure more Americans can participate in our democracy and that our voting rights are protected by our elected leaders. And so please join me in welcoming Beto O'Rourke.
All right. Thank you. Nsé, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the extraordinary work that you and the New Georgia Project are doing to bring in new generations of voters and make sure that our democracy in this state is truly reflective of the people who live in the state, all of the people who live in the state. So we've been watching from afar in Texas and have been incredibly impressed, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want to thank the Old Lady Gang, that's who's hosting us here.
Nice.
Today in this beautiful space. Each of you for taking some time to come out and spend it with me, to welcome me, to listen to me, but more importantly, to share with me your stories. What's most important to you? We can talk about voting rights and democracy, which is what I will begin with, but really we can talk about anything on your mind. Before we began the live part of this program, I was claiming my Georgia roots. My grandfather, my mom was just telling me, was born in Metter, Georgia, and that prompted questions from you all about how I eat my grits. So we can also have that conversation as well. Lastly, I want to thank Sarah Riggs Amico, who was a candidate for Lieutenant Governor here in Georgia. To you and everyone who has either run or served or supports those who run and serve, regardless of your party affiliation, want to thank you for your willingness to engage in our democracy to make sure that it's truly hitting on all cylinders and that everyone's involved and represented. Very grateful for that. I thought I'd begin with a story about my home state of Texas and kind of put this conversation about democracy into perspective and show us both what the challenges are, what we're up against right now, and then maybe give us some hope or inspiration about how we can overcome some of those challenges. So before the 2018 midterm election in Texas, our state ranked 50th in the that have given us all a sense of most counties. Previous year had passed a law creating the all-white Democratic primary. And Texas in 1924, much like Georgia in 1924, was really a one-party state. It was a Democratic Party. And if you couldn't vote in the Democratic Party, and by law you couldn't in Texas, you were absolutely out of luck, out of your democracy altogether. Dr. Lawrence Nixon did not accept this. In fact, he took this case all the way to the Supreme Court twice, and it took him 20 years of persistence and courage and patience, but he went into the same exact polling place in 1944, 20 years later, finally able to cast his vote. You would think with that example, with that inspiration, we would be leading the country in voter participation going up into this midterm in 2018. But we see that though there was not an all-white primary, there was voter suppression based on race and ethnicity alive and well in the United States of America today. I want to tell you one other story to talk about how we can look at this going forward. There is one of those 254 counties that I visited in Texas, Waller County, and it's home to Prairie View A&M, an extraordinary historically black college. Now that college is over 70% people of color. That county is over 70% white. And those two facts are not unconnected to this. There was no early voting location at Prairie View A&M, which is in a remote part of the county, for the first week of early voting in Texas. To add to that, they had split that campus into two different voting precincts. So people were really confused about where their appropriate voting location was. But in the face of those efforts to suppress the vote and write people out of our democracy, students at Prairie View A&M stood up and literally marched to the voting location. And I was just talking to one of those students, Jessica Purnell. She organized 500 students to get out and vote. And I don't know who they voted for, but they made sure that their vote would count. And they are part of this. Texas went from 50th in the country in voter turnout to a state that in a midterm year almost passed our presidential election year turnout levels. Though I did not beat Ted Cruz, I was down 2.6% on election night, our democracy has been forever transformed for the better. There are two new members of the United States Congress, both Democrats replacing long-serving Republicans. We changed the composition of our state legislature. 17 African American women elected to judicial positions in Harris County, our largest county and the most diverse county in the United States of America, literally changing the face of criminal justice in that community. And young people in early voting turned up at a 500% increase from the previous midterm election. So there is a path to regain and reclaim our democracy. Based on the inspiration that we saw there, the inspiration that we see here from the New Georgia Project, from your race, from Stacey Abrams, and from the understanding that it's not only about the elections, but it's about the policies that follow. There would be no new anti-choice bill signed into law if Stacey Abrams were our governor here in the state of Georgia. So I think we all understand the implications and the consequences if we can't get this right. So as NSA just said, we announced an ambitious, very bold proposal to reclaim our democracy for this country. And I want to lay out for you the three central pillars of that. First, let's bring more people into our democracy. Our plan calls for us to have 50 million newly registered voters over the course of the next 4 years. If a significant percentage of them turn out to vote, we're looking at 65% voter turnout nationally by 2024, we'll have 35 million new voters whose votes and voices will be brought to bear on the challenges and opportunities of this country. We're going to make sure that we have automatic and same-day voter registration, and that we pre-register 16 and 17 years olds so that when they turn 18, they are ready to go, ready to vote, and ready to participate in our democracy. Second, we're going to remove barriers to access, a new Voting Rights Act, and no one has been more eloquent or powerful on this than Stacey Abrams. We are going to follow her lead to make sure that there can be no effort to suppress voter participation. So voter ID laws or purging the voter rolls, as we saw here in Georgia and as they attempted to do in Texas, we will make sure that that cannot happen anymore. We're going to make sure that there are more voting and polling locations. We know that that was a problem here in Georgia, and that they are accessible to everyone and follow ADA standards. Last and third, and perhaps the most important pillar of this, we're going to restore confidence in our elections and in our democracy. We're going to make sure that there is security at the ballot box and that you can count on the fact that the vote that you cast will go to the intended recipient. We will require paper receipts and or paper ballots at all voting locations going forward. We're going to end the process of gerrymandering, whereby members of Congress choose their own voters instead of the other way around. We're going to get big money out of our politics, so no more political action committees contributing to the races of members of Congress, because it turns out that they'll listen to those PACs and the corporations and special interests that they represent before they listen to us. I'm also calling for term limits for members of Congress and term limits for members of the Supreme Court. If we're going to have faith in one another and faith in this democracy, then we should believe that someone can succeed a current member of Congress and do just as good or maybe even a better job than they have been able to do. I think if we take these steps, if we really show that we have faith in the greatest mechanism humankind has ever devised to unleash our potential and our genius, this country is going to be able to meet the challenges before us. Now, whether that is healthcare for all, a more inclusive economy, confronting climate change before it's too late, we can't meet these challenges by half measures or half steps or only half the country. We need to include and involve every single one of us in the process. So that is my proposal. These are some of the stories that inspired us to take this step and to try to bring more of our fellow Americans into the process. I would now love to hear from you, your stories about your involvement in our democracy, your ideas for how we can make it better. And then I think over the course of the conversation, we'll transition in to other issues that you want to talk about. Absolutely. So thank you all.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. I think we'll start with you. We have multiple mics. Well, hello, I know.
My name is Sarah Tyndall Gazelle. I've been in Georgia. I first moved here in 1992, so I've been here for a fair while. I am the Director of Voter Protection for the State Democratic Party, and I've been in this position for the last 16 months, so I served as the Voter Protection Director for our coordinated campaign last year. The news came out today that in North Carolina, the Department of Homeland Security is going to be investigating some of their electronic poll books, because in 2016, there were voters who showed up to cast their ballot and they were told they'd already voted. That happened here too in 2018. I was reviewing some of our records today, looking at what happened, and honestly, there was so much I've forgotten. So that happened in our primary. Voters showed up at a county and were told they'd already cast their ballots. And nobody ever followed up on it. These voters who called me, we were able to get them to make sure they did vote. It was chalked up to a software glitch. On election day and in early voting, there were numerous hundreds, if not thousands of voters that we know of who were turned away, told that their records couldn't be found. So this is clearly an election security issue, but about our registration system. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your plans, both as a candidate and as president, what you would do to help secure our voter registration records and those lists. Yeah,
thank you so much, Sarah, for the question and for the work that you've been doing for the past 16 months. I can't think of anything more important. It's worth remembering that our form of government is really the exception and not the rule in world history. And 243 years ago, when we started out on this experiment, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it would work. And so it's a very special, very extraordinary thing that we have right here. And we lose it at our peril. I mean, we'll lose everything that is so distinguishing about the United States, everything that makes us the greatest country on the face of the planet. And if people no longer believe that this democracy works and they no longer participate in it, we will absolutely lose it.
Can we pause you for a second? I think we have a mic issue.
Keep going? Okay,
Yep,
sorry. We're going to keep going. So how do we meet this challenge? Our plan calls for significant investment from the federal government in the states to make sure that we have the highest levels of voter security, not just at the ballot box, but as you suggest, in voter registration rolls. We will prevent secretaries of state like yours here and like our former Secretary of State tried to do just now in Texas from purging the voter rolls unless we can absolutely confirm that that voter no longer lives at that address or in that precinct or in that state. That's obviously not taking place today. The Voting Rights Act that has been stripped, frankly, by the Supreme Court has made it a lot easier for states to do it, and given a lot more of our fellow Americans another reason just not to vote because they're not sure that they can trust the outcome. Having a paper receipt is incredibly important too at the end of the entire process. Anecdotally, I remember getting calls on election day in Texas in November, folks saying, you know, I voted for you, Beto, but when I got the confirmation page on our electronic voting screen, it said I had voted for Ted Cruz. I'm glad I caught it. I went back and checked it. How often is that happening? We don't know. Right now, it's anecdotal.
Things that President O'Rourke will be able to enact, and that we have a major election before that is a reality, right? And so when I think about sort of 2018, right, and in Georgia in particular, but I'm certain it's not the case just in Georgia, I'm thinking about you know, the idea that people are voting on voting machines, in Georgia at least, that were 18 years old, and the machines were old enough to vote themselves, right? And there are YouTube videos of, you know, 10-year-olds sort of hacking into our machines. And internally in our office, when people would call in and report like all of the shenanigans that you've heard and that you've mentioned here, you know, there was a joke, like, is it the Republicans or the Russians, right? And so the question is, or the follow-up is, you know, we have a major election before your platform and your policies can be enacted. What can elected officials and voters do now to protect themselves, to protect our elections, to protect the vote in advance of this next really, really critical election?
Yeah. It's made all the tougher because you have a president who not only invited a foreign power to involve themselves in our democracy, who not only covered up and obstructed the investigation into what happened in 2016, but still fails to admit, unless you saw that tweet that he sent out and then deleted where he admitted Russia helped him win the election, fails to admit that we were attacked, that our democracy was in some significant way undermined by a foreign power, which implies that he is not focused and vigilant against another attack coming forward. So as you suggest, whether it was the Russians, whether it was a given political party from without or from within, we really have to be guarded against a manipulation of the vote count, a manipulation of public opinion, as we saw on Facebook and our social media channels, by the Russian government. No doubt about that anymore. And the cynicism and the confusion that invites on the part of our fellow Americans. Can I trust this? Does it work? And then a president who will really stop at nothing. So I mentioned that I'm from El Paso, Texas. For some reason, though this has never happened in my entire 46 years in that community, the Border Patrol were going to organize crowd control exercises in El Paso, Texas on Election Day, in a county of the 254 that saw the highest voter turnout increase. Is that a coincidence? Is it an effort to suppress voter participation in a city that also has a lot of mixed immigration status families? So this guy is going to stop at nothing. It just means that we have to be incredibly strong, very courageous, and supremely persistent in making sure that we see this through and support people like you who are literally standing guard at the ballot box to make sure that our votes are counted and our voices are heard. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
You stole my question.
My
name is Star Whitley. I am native to Atlanta. I won't say how long that is, but I was born here. And my question really goes back to the protection of our voters. So if we get, you know, everyone registered, we get everyone out to vote, how are we ensuring that we're protecting their vote? So would you send anyone out to monitor the Secretary's office in order to oversee the elections?
Yes. take your mic, Star. Thank you. Thanks for the question. And if you wanted to add something else on this mic, you're welcome to.
So I just wonder who would monitor the Secretary of State's office, seeing that they oversee the elections on the state level? Who would do that nationally?
Yeah. So great question. Thank you for asking it. And thank you for reminding us that this is not going to be easy. Won't simply be enacting new legislation or sending greater resources to the various states. It's also going to require the Department of Justice vigorously enforcing the Voting Rights Act, especially in the states of the former Confederacy. I mentioned Dr. Lawrence Nixon's story starting in 1924 and taking us all the way through 2018 to show that the progress is not guaranteed and in fact can even roll backwards. No reason we should be 50th in voter turnout, but for a state legislature that would stop at nothing and was not stopped by the Department of Justice. So as I watched what happened in Georgia from my home state of Texas during our election, and I saw the lines that stretched hours long, voting machines that didn't work in some cases, which I know you are so familiar with, and really the implication being, and I mentioned Waller County in Texas, that some people were not intended to vote. Some voices were not intended to be heard. You need an incredibly strong civil rights division of the Department of Justice that is guaranteeing that people are not waiting in extraordinarily long lines, that the voting machines are working, that we have paper ballots and or paper receipts, that we can perform an audit on these elections in the various precincts or counties and or states. And does this require an investment? Absolutely. But the consequence of failing to make this investment is our very democracy, and I'm not willing to pay that price. So let's make sure that we invest in this, and let's make sure that we have a president who believes in this. Because again, right now we have a president who denies that any of this is happening and is inviting the involvement of foreign powers in our elections. We will take a very, very strong approach to this. So a new Voting Rights Act that is funded and vigorously enforced.
Thank you.
Thank you, Star.
Hi, my name is Serbi Berrywall. I moved to Georgia about a year ago, and last election I volunteered on the Georgia Democrats Voter Protection Hotline. Before I called Georgia home, I lived in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Those are both states that have made headlines over the last few years for partisan gerrymandering. I know you mentioned earlier that that's something that you would prioritize, ending gerrymandering. What policies would you support as president?
Yeah. So thank you for the question, Serbi, and thanks for being here and for your work on voter protection. Really, really important. Right now, essentially, in most states, it's members of Congress who literally get together and decide who their constituents will be. What we need, in contrast, are citizen-led, no politicians allowed, I can't be in the room, commissions that draw those boundaries along rational lines. I mentioned Prairie View A&M being split in half into two different precincts. Makes absolutely no sense unless you're trying to make it harder for people to vote, and that's probably exactly what has happened. You look at some of the gerrymandered districts in Texas. You have a district Mike McCall represents that stretches from Houston to Austin, Texas, two completely different communities in two different parts of the state. A real stretch to say that that is a common constituency, but that's what happens when we have partisan and then in Texas racial and ethnic gerrymandering. So ending the process by which members of Congress choose their own voters is fundamental to getting our democracy back, and we do that with citizen-led redistricting commissions. Thanks for asking the question, Serbi.
My name's Aiden Gannon. I'm a high school senior from Atlanta, Georgia, born and raised. And as someone who's turning 18 in July, I'm really excited to get involved in the political process. But I also have friends and peers who are disillusioned or disinterested. As president, how do you plan to address youth voter turnout?
Thank you. Aiden, thank you for being here and for your excellent choice in shirt selection tonight. You know, I really think you have the answer to that one, and it's really not me that we should be listening to. And I'll tell you why. I mentioned that heroic leadership that we saw at Prairie View A&M and amongst other young people in Texas. Not only did they turn out at record numbers, and this is, as you probably know, a population that is always written off and counted out. In fact, in any campaign that I've run, I've been warned not to campaign with young people. Why waste your time? They don't turn out, they don't vote. Our answer to that is I wouldn't vote either if no one showed up and listened to me, included my story, my concerns, my hopes, my ideas in the campaign that we're running. So that's why we were showing up everywhere across Texas. And in this presidential campaign, we've had 34 town halls at 34 separate colleges and high schools and even in a middle school, making sure that everyone is included. And what I have found is that young people are leading on the most important issues today. The young people who led the walkouts from their classrooms, the marches for our lives, they're going to be the ones who ensure that the 40,000 of our fellow Americans who are killed by gun violence every year will not have died in vain. That we have universal background checks, close all loopholes. We stop selling weapons of war into our communities. We have red flag laws so that if someone is a danger to themselves or someone else in their life, they're stopped before it is too late. Their fierce advocacy for dreamers, more than 1 million young Americans, every bit as American as anyone else, yet they live in constant fear of deportation back to a country they do not know. It's been young people who've been the strongest advocates for them and making them U.S. citizens in this, their home country. And then just one last example, climate change. You're going to live with the consequences of what we do or fail to do far more than I will or anyone who is older than I am. And that may explain the urgency that I feel from you and other young people on this who remind us that we've got about 10 years. That's all the time remaining within which to act, free ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels, embrace renewable energy, and make sure that we lead the world in keeping this climate from warming another 2 degrees Celsius. So I spend so much time with young people because that's where the action and the energy is right now. That's where the leadership is, and those are the people that I'm inspired by. And part of the reason that automatic voter registration is so important to this is bringing those young people in automatically. You turn 18, we've pre-registered you at 17 or even 16 years old, so you're ready to go your first election when you're age eligible to vote. That's going to make this democracy so much better. We're going to get action on these issues that have really waited in some cases for decades. Climate, decades. Immigration, decades. Gun sense legislation, we've waited decades. We will not be waiting anymore as soon as you're voting. And so that's why we prioritize you in this plan. Thank you, Aiden, for asking. Appreciate it.
Sure. Beto, thank you so much for being here and for talking about some of the really egregious voter suppression issues that we saw in Georgia last year. You know, I had the opportunity, I'm Sarah Mako, I live in West Cobb County, Georgia, where 4 generations of my family have been transplanted from the Southwest Missouri Ozarks. So this is our adopted home. And as a candidate last year for statewide office, I had a chance to travel through 150 counties in Georgia. And what I saw was a level of excitement and enthusiasm and pride in having something to vote for, not someone to vote against, that I've never seen in my life. And I worry about the folks who had that enthusiasm and that hope and came out, and then after the election was said and done, saw the extent of voter suppression, saw that there are more than 100,000 votes missing from the machines in the lieutenant governor's race. And I wonder, what is it that you could do as president? You know, you've talked a lot about your policies to address the erosion of really what are the foundational elements of our democracy, whether that's the free press, checks and balances, you know, an independent judiciary. Everything is under assault. But the thing that I keep coming back to is how do we tell the people who finally showed up? We had record voter turnout in the state. How do we assure them that it's worth it to come back again? And that we're not always going to be perfect, but we're going to take one step forward every chance we have the opportunity. And how, as president, can you drive that ethos forward?
Great question. And again, thank you for running and for visiting all those counties and for going to where people are and listening to them and including them, bringing them in. I really think that's what this is all about. When we were getting ready to come out here, Ensei and I were talking about all the work that led to 2018. And so in Texas, we were talking about Wendy Davis, her 2014 campaign, Battleground Texas, the Texas Organizing Project. Here in Georgia, I believe starting in 2014, the New Georgia Project, all the work that went into making 2018 so successful. And again, though some of these races were not won, I'm confident that this democracy in this state has been transformed, and people are excited about 2020. In my home state, we're able to point to some of those great turnouts that led to great elections. So we helped to flip the House of Representatives with those 2 new members of Congress, and that new House of Representatives with a Democratic majority just passed the DREAM Act, talking about dreamers. They just passed H.R. 1, which is a suite of democracy reform bills that are much like the proposal that I introduced today. And they also passed gun sense legislation. So all these things that we've been waiting for, these elections produced majorities that then produced the change that we all so urgently want to see. Now we have to carry that on and make sure that we win new Senate seats in Georgia, win new Senate seats in Texas, have a majority in that chamber as well, and then a president with whom we can see our priorities reflected, the urgency of the issues that are most important to us. We really begin to define this country in a far more powerfully positive way on all of these and many other issues that we care about. So you ask, how do we help people to keep the faith when we've lost an election, or when our voices have been silenced, or when our votes have been suppressed? I think we keep doing what we have been doing. Keep bringing people in, keep supporting world-class candidates for school board and county commissioners court, for U.S. president, for Senate, for every race in between, and just keep that fire stoked. I think that's what we've seen in our 2 states, is it wasn't a function of 2018, and it wasn't just the candidates. In fact, it was someone on my team put it this way, just as or maybe more important as the person who's on the ballot are the people who choose who will win off of that ballot. So bringing people in is everything. So it sounds like you have it. You haven't lost that hope or that drive or that ambition for your state and your country. Let's just continue to stoke that in others. Yeah, thank you.
So we're going to role play a little bit just based off of Sarah's questions. So you're an old lady gang, right? Enjoying some of, Atlanta's most awesome soul food, right? And you, like, busboy asks you, right, who are you? Handsome, tall, white guy. And you say, I'm Beto O'Rourke and I'm running for president. And this person's like, well, I don't vote because my vote doesn't matter, right? 50,000 voters were purged, or voter registrations were held up in 2018, most of them black, right? So, like, why should I vote? Like, so he doesn't know about school board, doesn't know about, like, what is your message? Yeah. Because when we talk about swing voters, like for those of us who get down into the numbers, the swingiest voters are not people who go from party to party, it's the people who swing from non-voter to voter. So busboy is like, yeah, I don't vote. I don't see the point. My vote doesn't matter. How do you respond to that?
I love this question, and I love what you and I were talking about earlier. Texas, Georgia, not red states, they're non-voting states. If everyone were to be able to register, and those who registered were encouraged to vote, or there were not obstacles put in their place, or their votes were truly counted, we would be, I don't know if you want to define us by color, purple or blue, but we would be voting. And at the end of the day, that's really what matters for this democracy to work. The first thing that I'd say in answer to your question is, no joke, I've been so surprised at how many busboys tell me, I voted for you. I'm so excited to vote in 2020. I'm voting for somebody else, but I'm voting. Folks are so engaged right now. I haven't seen, the despair or the depression that one might have expected following 2016 and 2018 by some. In fact, I just see even greater engagement and excitement. But if this were one of the few who's not fully bought into our democracy, does not think it works, and maybe for valid reasons. And Texas understands that perhaps based on his race or ethnicity has literally been drawn out and has reached the logical conclusion, my vote does not count for as much as someone else's who's been drawn in. I'd say this. The only way we're going to achieve anything that you possibly care about. I don't know what you're making busting tables. Is it $7.25 an hour? If you want to be able to just work one job, because you're probably working 2 or 3 right now to make ends meet at $7.25 an hour, because we set a minimum wage at $15 an hour, then you're going to have to vote. It's the only way that it will come to pass. If you want to take time off to be able to take care of yourself or your kids or your mom and have paid family leave, that is a political decision that will follow an election that you must participate in. If you cannot afford health care right now, you're supposed to take insulin for your diabetes, but you just cannot afford it, though we live in the wealthiest and most powerful country on the face of the planet, and you believe in universal, guaranteed, high-quality health care, you are going to have to vote. And I think Sarah and I and everyone here are going to say, we are going to be vigilant on your behalf. We're going to admit that there are some problems in our democracy today, that not everyone is treated fairly or equally, and there are active efforts to suppress your vote. So we're going to acknowledge the truth that you probably feel and may have kept you from voting thus far, but we are with you, we are on your team, and we're going to make sure that if we win these elections, we implement the most ambitious set of democracy reforms to fix this democracy so that it works for you and everyone else. That'd be the speech I'd give them. Since we're role playing right now, what does the busboy say in response?
He's like, okay. Okay.
That's fair.
Yeah,
That's fair.
okay, all right. And also, did you leave a tip?
Yeah.
Who's next?
Congressman O'Rourke, thank you so much for being here. To shift gears for a second, I'm Bobby Kaufman. I'm a native Texan, and I'm a high school English teacher here in Atlanta. And like you, I was an English major. I was wondering, what books most shaped your character that you read in high school, college, and beyond?
Yeah, great question. I don't know how your parents reacted when you told them you were an English major, but I remember the deep look of disappointment on my dad's face. Yours as well? Yeah. They had taken out loans for me to go to college. I took out student loans, and they said, we're spending all this money. You're working a work-study job. You're working so hard and to read books. Why don't you do something real, like be an accountant or study biology or engineering, something you can only do in college? But if my dad were here today, I'd tell him that I think everything worked out. And those stories that I learned and read and discussed with others in that classroom about the Odyssey, just to pick one book to help answer your question, this story of war and of homecoming and of friendship and of family and of just catastrophic loss and the persistence through all of that is stayed with me for life. And I joke that the only reason we named our firstborn Ulysses is because we didn't have the guts to name him Odysseus, because the book had made such an impact on us. I think about that when I think about kids in high school, maybe even college students who aren't able to read the full texts of books right now, mainly in high school, not so much a problem in college, because of standardized test prep and these high stakes, high pressure tests that teachers are judged on, though it in no way fully measures their performance or that kid's potential in the classroom. And this was brought home to me by talking to a high school senior at El Paso High who told me that she's reading the abridged version of the Odyssey because they have to set aside 2 weeks for standardized test prep, and they can't afford to read the whole book. But I feel like I don't know how you feel about this, but campaigns for me are really stories. I mean, everyone has their Odyssey, what they have persisted through, what they have lived through, what they have overcome, the friends that they've met along the way, the friends that they've lost along the way, that family member that they may never see again, and expressed through different things that we can take as policy prescriptions, or just take in a way to define the American character in this really powerful way. This one country that, unlike almost every nation on the planet, almost unlike every other nation on the planet, is not defined by race or ethnicity. It's the fact that we all brought our stories here from wherever we're from originally across the planet. And listening to those stories and blending them into our common American story is what I think this is all about at the end of the day. So really good question. Thanks for asking.
I absolutely love that. And so, as you know, there are probably like 1,400 people seeking the Democratic nomination for president.
More or less.
Right, give or take a few. And so I'm curious, what is the story? What's the narrative of the Beto for President campaign? Is there a book, or is there, or I imagine that it's being written right now.
Yeah.
So what do you want the narrative to be about the campaign?
So,
why are you running for president?
born and raised in El Paso, Texas. I've told you all a little bit about it, but I want to brag a little bit about El Paso. It's one half of the largest binational community in the Western Hemisphere. So with Ciudad Juarez, our sister city to whom we are connected, there are nearly 3 million of us speaking 2 languages, 2 nationalities, 2 cultures, 2 histories, but we're joined, not separated by the Rio Grande River. And it's just something beautiful that defies measure. But one of those things that we can look at is the fact that El Paso, Texas is one of, if not the safest cities in the United States of America. And that's not despite the fact that we're a city of immigrants and that we're connected with Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. I'd say it's because we're a city of immigrants and people chose us. A quarter of those with whom we live were born in another country. And the way I think about it, maybe coming back to the Odyssey, you know, they left their homeland, their language, their culture, their family, their community, to start over again as strangers in a strange land. And they did so certainly to do better for themselves and their kids, just as I would, but they also did so because they were called to and inspired by us. And you think about this moment where we have a president who wants to put those kids who have traveled nearly 2,000 miles from the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today, much of that journey by foot, some of it atop a train known as the Beast or La Bestia, put them in cages, deport their mothers back to the very countries from which they fled, separate those families, in some cases perhaps forever, without knowing when they'll be able to see each other again. I know that we can be better than that. We live that in El Paso. We live that throughout this country. So bringing people in, as we've been talking about today, at this very divided moment, ensuring that our democracy works for everyone has been my life's work. On city council, holding town hall meetings like this every single week for 6 years, doing it monthly as a member of Congress, finding Republican partners when I was in the minority to get things done like expanding mental health care for veterans or protecting public lands, and then running this campaign in Texas, perhaps much like the one you ran in Georgia, where we went to every county and counted no one out, wrote no one off, took nobody for granted. It didn't matter your party affiliation, your race, your sexual orientation, how many generations you can count yourself an American, or whether you just got here last week. We wanted you in the conversation, we included you, and we helped to take a state that had ranked 50th in voter turnout to one that is a contender today. It's 38 electoral college votes now unlocked. Competition, everyone has a seat at the table. So that's a little bit of what I think I bring to this, a little bit of what inspires me to run for president, to see us achieve our full potential, live our full promise as a country. It's going to take all of us coming into this democracy.
Thank you. We are coming close to our time. Do we have, we'll take one more question. Who has a mic?
Have the mic.
Okay.
My name is Billy Michael Honor. I've been living here in Georgia for 17 years, and I'm Director of Faith Organizing for the New Georgia Project with NSA. In my work, I get to deal with faith communities all across Georgia. And you're in Georgia, and it's no surprise this is the home of Dr. Martin Luther King. In these settings, I hear a lot of King quotes all the time. But the one that I like the most is the March on Washington. Not the I have a dream part, but the part where he says, we've come here to Washington, all of us, and we've come here to the vault of democracy, and we have received a check from the vault, and it's came back marked insufficient funds. And he's talking about the unfinished work that has been done as a result of slavery, racism in this country. And so here we are. You're running for president. You're in a city full of African Americans, full of King quotes. What can you say to us that will happen in terms of economic inequality and bridging the gap between the rich and the poor in this city, reparations? What can you say to us that will help us to understand how you as president would make change on these issues that have been intractable for so long?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's really powerful, and thank you for the work that you're doing with the New Georgia Project. I was in Charleston, South Carolina not too long ago, and I got to participate in a march that marked the 50th anniversary of the Medical University of South Carolina hospital workers strike. So 50 years ago, 1969, in fact, it happened not too long after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, and I believe it was the first event that Coretta Scott King attended. Ralph Abernathy was there as well, and this was really a continuation of Dr. King's work on the Poor People's Campaign. These hospital workers, primarily African-American women, were being paid a fraction of what their white and male counterparts were being paid. And finally, they struck, and their strike really galvanized the community and captured the conscience of the country. They were joined by hundreds and then thousands. And I would like to think that it changed things forever for the better. But as I'm marching with Pastor Dixon, and I said, so tell me all the great things that have followed in these last 50 years, he said, no, Beto, actually things are worse for the hospital workers today at MUSC than they were in 1969. Any illusion that I'd labored under, and frankly, probably unique to my being a white man, that progress was persistent and inexorable was shattered in 2016 in that election. And daily, when I listen to people about their lived experiences, about those hospital workers who cannot afford to get care in the very hospital in which they work today. And a problem that I thought was really centered on the criminal justice system. Why do we have 2.3 million people behind bars, the highest rate of imprisonment on the face of the planet, and the people serving are disproportionately comprised of color? It starts in not high school, where I thought the school to prison pipeline began, but in kindergarten, where I've learned that black kids are 5 times as likely to be disciplined or suspended or expelled as white kids. And then it's not unconnected to the economy, where there's 10 times the wealth in white America today than there is in black America. Healthcare. In Texas and perhaps in Georgia, we're in the midst of a maternal mortality crisis, but is 3 times as deadly for women of color. And so the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and suppression that I just described in our democracy, in our campaigns, in how we draw congressional districts is alive and well in this country. And when I listen to you and I listen to other leaders on these issues, a conversation that I had with Brian Stevenson that forever changed how I looked at this, where he said, Beto, you and others, and I think with the best of intentions, talk about the Edmund Pettus Bridge and John Lewis, and we were talking about the Friendship 9 in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or the Greensboro 4, the Freedom Riders. All of that is important. Let's celebrate their victories, but let's also acknowledge everything else that's going on, because sometimes we satisfy ourselves with those victories and think we, meaning Beto, a white guy, think that the job is done. So the idea that we squarely face this legacy and begin the work of reparation with repair by knowing the full story of this country, how the wealth was built, on whose backs it was built, who enjoyed that wealth afterwards, and who was literally redlined or locked out of that wealth forever. It's the only way that we repair, and it's the only way that we stop visiting those injustices on future generations. So signing House Bill 40, written by Sheila Jackson Lee, is a priority of my administration, and making sure that conversation continues in every single community until we really get justice. That's going to be the goal of our administration. So thank you for asking the question. Appreciate it.
So I want to take a moment, just take a beat, and really thank you, right, for bringing your whole self to this conversation. These are my people, mi gente, and I'm really excited about what the future holds, and really excited about having you here in Georgia, and that you are lifting up these really critical, foundational issues. So if you all will join me in thanking Beto.
Thank you all very much. Gracias. Gracias.
De nada. De nada. All right. My French is way better than my Spanish.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. It is. But listen, I was going to say something that was really disrespectful, but it's really about my love of food and less about the Spanish language. I was going to be my Spanish is amazing.